Well, the recent situations of armed conflict in the Middle East, whether in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, or Palestine, and the tremendous amount of destruction and human suffering that accompanied these armed conflicts, too often put IHL rules into question. Simply because every single person in this part of the world, in the Middle East, they do have encounter with some sort of hostilities one way or another. Again, directly or indirectly, they do feel the scourge of war, and they know how bitter the war tastes. Therefore, I would claim from my experience in working in this part of the world for the last 5 years that Middle Eastern do feel the need of IHL more than ever. However, unfortunately, the warring parties pay little attention to these rules. Therefore, people in the Middle East usually ask, does ICRC do anything about the implementation of IHL in this part of the world? And they always ask about the relevance of IHL in the wars of today that they witness every day in their home countries.
What is clear in the dynamics of the Middle East these days is that there is a sort of narrative of exceptionalism that is quite clear to everybody, attached to all what is happening in the region and beyond. Today, as a matter of fact, most fighting parties in the Middle East, including states, resort to exceptional violence because of claimed exceptional circumstances. On one side, the proliferation of non-state armed groups. On the other, the asymmetric warfare. Again, the struggle for survivor narrative that we hear more and more. But also the need to rely upon different bodies of law other than the international humanitarian law or the international law. That's why more and more the Islamic international Sharia is mentioned as a reliable body of law to rely upon or to refer to. This tendency to exceptionalism is actually challenging the applicability of what we knew over the last couple of decades as the normative framework of international relations, including IHL. Symptoms, or probably consequences, of this trend seems, on one side, the paralysis of the United Nations Security Council, entirely incapable of political solutions in Syria or in Yemen, for instance, or the abuse of counter-terrorism laws in many countries, but also dehumanization of the opponent. That's a very worrisome feature of today's narratives. I use the plural form. Again, the increasing authoritarianism in many regimes as a consequence or a symptom of this trend that I just tried to describe. Finally, the loss of monopoly on the use of force by the states, seen as more and more delegating to proxies and non-state actors the struggle against their enemies. As a consequence, to sum up the second part, the protection of civilians and detainees became a massive challenge in all this context. Engaging with different actors with multinational projection and scope of action became also very difficult.
The main alibi used by states, here and elsewhere, this is not specific to the Middle East, to avoid discussions about the respect of international humanitarian law is to deny the existence of an armed conflict. For the rest, generating respect, I fully agree, is the main challenge, because violations are the main problem. And here, a lot of progress has been made in prevention. When it comes to mechanisms to ensure respect of humanitarian law during armed conflicts, unfortunately, except for the ICRC, they do not function. Protecting powers, the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission, which would be so important to determine the facts because most of the time what is controversial is not the law, but simply those who violate, they say, we did not violate, it's the other side. So it would be important, but it doesn't work. And the problem is the political will, the lack of political will by states. If there was political will, the mechanisms would work. And if the political will lacks, as it does, and not only in the Middle East, believe me, it lacks, new mechanisms will not be created or will not be able to function properly. However, let's not be too pessimistic. Mechanisms can create political will.
لكن في ظل كل ذلك يصاب المرء بالدهشة والحيرة عندما يرى الانتهاكات الجسيمة لأحكام القانون الدولي الإسلامي، وهذا طبعا يعني ظاهرة تستوجب الوقوف للدراسة على أسبابها واتخاذ الإجراءات اللازمة من كل من المعنيين، سواء من أولا العلماء المسلمين أو الحكومات أو مؤسسات المجتمع المدني لمحاربة مثل هذا التطرف. أولا الفجوة الكبيرة بين النظرية والتطبيق، لأن القانون الدولي الإنساني الإسلامي كان بمثابة اجتهادات من الفقهاء المسلمين القدامى، ولم يتم تقنينه من قبل الدولة الإسلامية على مدار التاريخ الإسلامي، مثل الكثير من باقي مجالات القانون الإسلامي، ووضع ضوابط لتطبيقه من ناحية وعقوبات لمن يخالفه من ناحية أخرى، على الرغم من أن الالتزام بأحكام القانون الإسلامي عموما هو ينبع أولا وقبل كل شيء من رغبة المسلم في الالتزام بأحكام هذا القانون الذي له طابع ديني. رقم 2، إهمال غالبية العلماء المسلمين في العصر الحديث البحث في هذه المجالات، ولا سيما التي تنظم شؤون الدولة، ولا سيما في مجال نظام الحرب ونظام الحكم والعلاقات الدولية، وذلك يعني لأسباب ثقافية وسياسية تتعلق ببنية الدولة الحديثة في العالم الإسلامي، والتي ابتعدت بدرجة كبيرة عن الاعتماد على التراث الفقهي للعلماء المسلمين القدامى واستبداله بنظام يعني قانوني غربي. هذا بدوره خلق يعني حالة من الفراغ العلمي التي أدت للأسف إلى تسلل الكثير من غير المتخصصين في القانون الإسلامي، بل والمتطرفين الذين يقدمون تفسيراتهم على أنها تمثل صحيح الإسلام. السبب الثالث هو ضعف مؤسسات المجتمع المدني في الكثير من دول الشرق الأوسط، وغياب ثقافة الإصلاح والتوعية في معالجة القضايا المجتمعية، وذلك لأسباب منها أن هذه المهمة أصبحت حكرا على الدولة فقط.
Now, the ICRC makes an admirable work as a humanitarian organization, which limits, however, its ability to react to violations, not with the victim, but publicly, and to mobilize states to ensure respect of humanitarian law, as they must under Article 1 common to the Geneva Conventions, which obliges all states, not only in the region, but also those who support, to ensure respect. And to appeal to the public opinion, because understandably the ICRC's priority is access. It wants to help the people who suffer And if you want to help the people who suffer, you better do not criticize those who make them suffer.
Now, how ICRC is navigating, operating, addressing the needs in this chaotic region and context. We are a minor but still relevant actor on the humanitarian scene, and we committed our largest budget per region in the Middle East, almost $400 million, together with thousands of men and women representing the backbone of the Red Cross and Red Crescent action. This doesn't mean that we managed to address the most urgent needs. This doesn't mean we managed to reach out all who would need to be reached out before the others. The cry for help of civilians, of people besieged, people wounded, people detained, very often go unheard because of the challenges that we just mentioned before are very often overwhelming. However, there are few features that are still empowering our action as a very relevant action, and in particular the neutral and independency, the reputation of proximity with the people, the being pragmatic, the being efficient, the being credible. All these features proved and proves ensuring access to the victim of conflict, in particular in countries torn apart by internal strifes, where the stigma, often erroneous, I would say, of non-impartiality of national body may hamper acceptance and access to the victims.
States still believe that the major problem of armed groups will disappear if it is simply ignored in efforts to generate respect. States do not want to have an enforcement mechanism, a treaty body, or even a conference of states parties discussing violations. I think states then should not be astonished that the existing mechanisms of other branches deal with humanitarian law violations, the human rights mechanisms, the UN Security Council take over, although they are less qualified and more politicized. So somewhere these issues must be discussed, and if states do not want to have a specific forum for humanitarian law, it's understandable that it happens in other fora. But obviously, I understand that in particular concerning the Middle East, the action of political bodies, while sometimes seriously contributing to generating respect, is often selective. And I think selectivity is the greatest cancer to the law. And this undermines the credibility and gives an alibi to those who want to justify their violations, including before their peoples. Here again, it would, however, be crucial for the credibility of such efforts by outside powers to avoid selectivity. Regional powers in the Middle East and world powers who support one or the other party in an armed conflict should encourage those parties to respect international humanitarian law instead of being, at best, indifferent, if not committing or contributing to violations of international humanitarian law. Prevention remains the most promising avenue. And here in the Middle East, this should work particularly well. Because the Middle East, the birthplace of the three great religions of the book, is a fertile ground for teaching people the respect of rules, which are written down, not in a holy book, but in a book accepted by all the faithful of the different religions through their states, the Geneva Conventions. I'm obviously convinced that in prevention, religion can have an important role, but it is often abused of. And here, more in the Middle East than anywhere else in the world today, fortunately, leaders of all religions have clearly spoken out to clarify that their religion cannot justify violations of international humanitarian law.
الإسهام الفقهي لقدامى المسلمين الذي نجح بدرجة كبيرة ومثيرة للدهشة منذ أكثر من 14 قرن من الزمان، على الأقل على المجال أو على الصعيد النظري، في ضبط عملية سير القتال ما بين المسلمين وأعدائهم من غير المسلمين، أو حتى فيما يخص الصراعات ما بين المسلمين أنفسهم، وذلك في كل ما عالجه القانون الدولي الإسلامي، لكن بالطبع في سياق حرب مختلفة وهي التي عاصرها الفقهاء المسلمون، وبين واقع المسلمين حاليا في عدم الالتزام بكل من أحكام القانون الدولي الإنساني أو حتى القانون الدولي الإنساني الإسلامي. وهذا يدل على أولا أن أحكام القانون الدولي الإنساني الإسلامي لها طابع ديني، بمعنى أن الالتزام بها، أي الالتزام بأحكام القتال في الإسلام، هو عمل تعبدي، يعني يتقرب بها المسلم أو الجندي المسلم إلى الله عز وجل. ثانيا، وهذا الأمر أيضا في غاية الأهمية، هو أن التزام المسلمين القدماء بأحكام القانون الدولي الإنساني الإسلامي هو أمر كان يتقيد به المسلم من تلقاء نفسه ويفرضه على نفسه رغبة منه في احترام القانون الإسلامي أو إرضاء الله عز وجل، بصرف النظر عن التزام عدوه بمثل هذه الأحكام من عدمه. وأيضا لم يكن هذا الالتزام بسبب اتفاقيات دولية كما هو الحال في العصر الحالي. وهذا يوضح أسباب تركيز الفقهاء المسلمين على التفصيل في وضع أحكام ما يجوز وما يحرم على المسلم فعله أثناء الحرب. أولا القرآن الكريم، ثانيا السنة النبوية، بالإضافة طبعا إلى السوابق التاريخية للدولة الإسلامية، أو ما يسمى في كتب الفقه الإسلامي بسيرة أو طريقة الدولة الإسلامية في تعاملاتها أثناء وقت الحرب أو حتى وقت السلام، سواء كما هو الحال في عهد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أو في عهد الخلفاء الراشدين، وهو ما يطلق عليه في كتب الفقه تحديدا في المذهب الحنفي بباب السير. إن قدام الفقهاء المسلمين وضعوا أحكاما تفصيلية في ظل سياق الحرب التي عايشوها، وهذه الأحكام حددت أهم القضايا التي يعالجها القانون الدولي الإنساني. مثلا عالجوا قضية من الذي يجوز قتاله في الحرب، 2 الأسلحة التي يجوز استخدامها في الحرب، 3 معاملة الأسرى، 4 مدى مشروعية ضرب الدروع البشرية وضرب العدو ليلا، وهي قضيتين يشار إليهما في كتب الفقه تحت بابي التترس أو البيات، 5 تدمير ممتلكات العدو، 6 التمثيل بجسد العدو. مجمل كل هذه الأحكام الفقهية في هذه القضايا السبعة على الأقل تؤكد أن جل اهتمام الفقهاء المسلمين كان ينصب على أمرين 2: أولا عدم تعريض أرواح غير المقاتلين من الأعداء للخطر، 2 عدم تدمير ممتلكات العدو إلا للضرورة الحربية أو في حالة المعاملة بالمثل. وهذا يؤكد على الكرامة الإنسانية أو كرامة النفس البشرية حتى في ظل هذه الصراعات كما عالجها الفقهاء المسلمين. فعلى سبيل المثال تحريم قتال من لا يقاتل، عدم استخدام الأسلحة التي لا تفرق بين من يقاتل ومن لا يقاتل، وعدم ضرب الدروع البشرية أو عدم الهجوم على العدو ليلا. كل ذلك يدل على ماذا؟ يدل على احترام النفس البشرية، وأن القتال في الإسلام شرع فقط ضد من يقاتل من الأعداء. بالإضافة إلى ذلك فإن حسن معاملة الأسرى التي أمر بها الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم وذكرت في القرآن الكريم تؤكد على الحفاظ على الكرامة الإنسانية في وقت الحرب. ويدل على ذلك أيضا تحريم استهداف العدو في الوجه أو التمثيل بجسد العدو بعد موته لما له من حرمة في الكرامة الإنسانية. بل إن احترام العدو أيضا يشمل تحريم ممتلكاته تحريم تدمير ممتلكاته أثناء القتال إلا للضرورة الحربية.
Obviously, we would need collective action, and this is the idea of the UN Charter, and this is why the Security Council exists. But for the time being, in a lot of contexts, in particular in the Middle East, it is impossible. And therefore, we have unfortunately to fall back on individual action under Article 1 Common. Ensure respect.
The context of violence in which we work with many others require changes in the approach and functioning to face the challenges that I tried to highlight previously. We know that, and we are committed to adapt for the sake of beneficiaries. At the same time, one thing should be clear, and it is already clear to everybody, that there is no humanitarian solution to humanitarian problems. And that means that advocacy and pressure on driving forces and stakeholders is more and more necessary to ensure the respect of humanitarian action, the access to the wounded and the vulnerables, and respect for basic rules of international law. Many aspects of these humanitarian actions can be challenged.
وبناء على ذلك فإني أرى أن من بين أهم الحلول لتفعيل احترام أحكام القانون الدولي الإنساني عموما والقانون الدولي الإنساني الإسلامي في منطقة الشرق الأوسط ما يلي. أولا، الاهتمام البحثي والأكاديمي بمجال القانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي الإنساني الإسلامي تحديدا. ثانيا، عدم الاكتفاء بدراسة أحكام القانون الدولي الإنساني الإسلامي كما طورها قدام الفقهاء المسلمين في سياق الحرب التي عايشوها، وإنزال تلك الأحكام على واقع الصراعات المسلحة في الوقت الحاضر.
So the rationale behind having a panel like the one we have today is to call for multidisciplinary engagement from different perspectives: legal perspective, humanitarian perspective, Islamic perspective, so we can have a clear understanding about the status of implementation of IHL between the successes and the challenges. And hopefully by reaching a good level of understanding of the challenges and the successes of the implementation of IHL in the Middle East, we'll be able to create a more conducive environment that is sufficiently realistic and responsive to the tears and the suffering of the victims of the people in the Middle East, and ultimately to be followed and respected by the warring parties who have the primary responsibility to implement the law.